In this interactive video, we're going to cover a few of the more influential, more well-known concepts from Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger wrote in his own, well, he wrote in German originally, but even in German, he made up his own sort of language to go along with both the form and the content of what he was trying to say. And this makes him a particularly difficult philosopher for many people to read. So we know this going in. I haven't assigned you too much in terms of like long stuff to read. But just keep it in mind. It's a difficult, challenging read, no doubt. Okay, well, without further ado, um, so, oh, by the way, the assignment for this week is based in part on a quick School of Life video, so we won't start this interactive video with one of those embedded. You'll watch it in order to do the assignment. So we'll go through this really quickly. He was a German philosopher whose work is most commonly associated with phenomenology and also existentialism, but he wouldn't have dug that. And he really didn't care for labels of any sort, much less being called an existentialist. But he's because he has so much in common with other thinkers in the existentialist tradition, he tends to be grouped with them. Um, his ideas had a seminal influence on the development of contemporary European philosophy, and they also had a big impact beyond philosophy, like in architectural theory, in literary criticism, theology, psychotherapy, cognitive science, and also he has a large presence in environmental um, issues and deep ecology. And some of his works include Being in Time, that's considered his magnum opus, and Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. What is this thing called thinking? The question concerning technology, which we'll read next week, and a series of volumes on Nietzsche, amongst others. So the question of keep in mind, being with a capital B, right? He starts off Being in Time with this quote: Our aim in the following treatise is to work out the question of the meaning of being and to do so concretely. Our provisional aim is the interpretation of time as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. In other words, to understand the question of being itself, being with a capital B, you must understand it in terms of temporality or time. And that the concept of time itself, the concept of being itself are dependent upon one another. In other words, the question of being makes no sense if we were infinite and did not have to worry about time. And the question of time makes no sense if we don't get to the bottom of the question of being. So I know this is some heavy duty stuff. It's about that almost the heaviest duty philosophy you can get into. So just try to hang in there with me, and I'll do my best. So Heidegger's project in Being in Time it's an ambitious one. He wants to enrich and sharpen our understanding of what it means for something to be, to exist in a certain way, being, right? Really, he wants to strip down what the modern understanding of being and recreate it with help from the ancients and their understanding of being. The question of being, he thinks, has been forgotten. The being with a capital B, right? It's been forgotten, he says. It's been left behind by the philosophical tradition since the pre-Socratics, who were very concerned with the notions of being, becoming, and nothingness. Far from being an abstract philosophical notion that enjoys no efficacy outside of the universal walls, the way that we formulate and answer the question of being, he thinks, determines our very existence. And it's the ground upon which we build our world, and in turn are built by our world. And by describing some of the different modes of being that any being can have, he hopes to demonstrate how these modes of being are related to particularly human being, or in his own words, the beings for whom being is an issue, and then ultimately to time or temporality. Whew, heavy duty. Yeah. So what happened to being, capital B? At different times throughout history, philosophers, thinkers have suggested that being is to be accounted for in terms of like cosmic functions, God's creation, monads, unknowable things in themselves, matter or material stuff involved in causal relations, all sorts of accounts of being with a capital B. And Heidegger thinks that these theories, although these different theories disclose and reveal and clarify a great deal, they've also tended to give us a somewhat distorted and narrow view of the nature of reality. The nature of reality is just a collection of objects or various types that are just out there in space and time and independent of us. And the dominant understanding of reality in contemporary life is the one that emerged with the rise of modern science. And it's known as an objectified view of reality. In other words, the question of being, capital B, has been eclipsed, and we think we've got a handle on it. We know what being is. Being is material stuff in causal relations out there in the world, separated from us, that we can, as perceiving subjects, just behold, study, learn about, generate theories about, test these theories, subject them to the scientific method, and then develop technology based on those. And that is reality, period. We're stuff in the world just like any other stuff in the world involved in causal relations. So, in other words, that ancient question of being that held a lot of mystery, today's from contemporary eyes, this question doesn't matter to us any longer, Heidegger was saying. It's been eclipsed and supplanted by just a scientific view of human being and beings in the world and stuff in the world and maybe minds and perceptions. But we've lost something along the way, is really the best way to put it. So let's remember something that's known in philosophy as the subject-object distinction. And many thinkers believe that this really became sharpened and became an issue with Descartes, right? The cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, right? And this particularly in Descartes' Meditations, where he says, I can doubt the existence of everything, except I can't doubt that I'm doubting. I can't doubt that I'm thinking, right, without contradiction. And that this kind of really built a wall between human being and thinking and the outside world, whereas people earlier had a much more organic relationship between the way they thought and the world around them. It wasn't split and dichotomized as sharply until Descartes and Descartes' series of arguments and, the scientific revolution, etc. But um, the subject object distinction, given this objectified outlook, like let's imagine that this is the case, which I understand, given this outlook, how can we make sense of the idea that these objects is stuff outside of the world that just is material stuff in causal relations with other material stuff? How can we make sense of the idea that these objects contain meaning or values in themselves? And remember, we are, in this viewpoint, objects too. Our bodies are objects in the world. Um, Many scientifically oriented thinkers have assumed that reality consists only of intrinsically just meaningless and valueless objects. Values and meanings, if they even exist, can only exist in our minds, not out there in the world. The world's brute stuff outside of our minds, we're the ones that just as, perceiving subjects as kind of like minds in jars come up with values and meaning, and because it's just human creation, it and has no real bearing on the outside world or doesn't derive in any way from this outside world. Because of that, all of it's completely relative, and if that's the case, it becomes kind of meaningless in this perspective, right? And ipso facto, human beings are included. That means us too. So the objectified view of reality is correlated with a particular view of human beings. And according to this view, like I mentioned, we're just objects amongst others in the causal order of nature. But only this, right? From this, it follows that we're also subjects or minds who can represent objects in our ideas and can develop attitudes and beliefs about those objects. But what I'm trying to stress here again is this view that we're these rational thinking things completely separate from the physical world around us. It's out there to kind of put a show on for us. It's completely outside of us. We are self-contained thinking things. That stuff out there is self-contained non-thinking stuff. And that these minds we have strive to get this correct view of the external world in order to function in it efficiently, to understand the causal relationships going on out there so that we can adjust our thinking correctly to it. Thus, it's important to clearly distinguish what's really out there in objective reality, like the material objects that make up the universe, and what is purely subjective, a projection of our own feelings and desires onto things. So I'm sure that a lot of you employ that language, like, hey, this is just subjective or this is objective, right? What Heidegger is trying to push here is that there's a problem with separating stuff out so sharply that way that it artificially, in a sense, removes us from the world. It doesn't capture our absolute dependence upon it or its dependence upon us. So that could have been said better, but that's what I got for right now. So now, what's wrong with this subject-object distinction other than what I've already mentioned here? Well, this modern objectified worldview entails a pervasive sense of loss of meaning in life. If values and meanings are purely subjective constructs and products of our needs and desires alone, then it becomes difficult to see how there could be any solid basis for forming the notion of a genuinely higher or better way of life beyond just like everyday coping and doing what feels good. Right? If everything is subjective, then how can you ever improve? How can you ever get to know yourself more authentically, understand yourself more authentically, sharpen your ability to, just operate in the world on an everyday basis if all of this is subjective, is how this thinking goes. So, in other words, we lack the resources for envisioning the kind of better life implied in Socrates' words. What is important is not just to live, but to live well, right? Not just to survive and get along in whatever world we're thrown into, but to live well. So what he's saying is that if this all is just subjective preference, how can we come to any common understanding of what it means to live well as human being? So the concern with confronting this widespread sense of a loss of meaning in modern life, it's one of the central aims of Being and Time, his book. So let's take a look at the structure of human agency according to Heidegger. So first, humans are beings who care about what they are. We care about whether our lives make sense and what our lives amount to and whether our lives are our own. We care about these things. Therefore, things in general mean something to me in the sense that they count or they matter. They show up for me in some way in relation to my undertakings. That's first. Second, because humans care about who and what they are, they've always already taken some sort of stand on their lives. The stand, a position on their lives, it essentially amounts to what you care about. We've all, in a sense, seized on some set of roles, personality traits, lifestyles, and status relations in realizing our lives in the world. Third, we actually are the stands that we take as we live out our lives. We are what we do, and that's that. We don't have a fixed essence, no Aristotelian proper function that determines what we ought to be. Instead, we are beings in the world, and that's a Heideggerian phrase, beings in the world constituting or building ourselves within and from a particular historical culture. Fourth, now, if we are what we make of ourselves in our lives, then what's definitive of our being is not the continued presence of our bodies or our minds or some kind of substance of us of some sort, whether it be thought of exactly as mind or physical substance. Instead, the self for Heidegger is an event that's defined by what one does throughout the entirety of one's life. And Heidegger calls this a becoming or a happening. He understands the self as a becoming or a happening. Some of you who have taken other philosophy courses and studied the problem of personal identity, this may ring familiar to you, right? When we ask the question of what accounts for personal identity over time is one of the persistence question of identity. If I'm constantly changing, then how can how can I be the same person at time one as I am in 10 years, time two? I feel like the same person, but also kind of not, right? What is it? Is it some kind of substance that never changes? Is it a spirit that never changes? Is it just a continued set of causal relations from time one to time two? This is a big problem in classic philosophy, the persistence questions of identity. But Heidegger doesn't look for this. He says it's we ourselves, these things that we think of as ourselves are actually an ever unfolding becoming or happening. We're not looking for some kind of self substance in there or a ghost in the machine, as it were. Fifth, when understood as a life happening, ourselves or our human existence has a distinctive temporal structure, meaning time structure. It's always happening. And he calls this a throne projection. That we are essentially human being or a human being, let's say, we are thrown into the world at birth, let's say, boom, boom, and at a time in history, bam, we can't choose that, right? We're thrown into this world and we are constantly, from cradle to grave, unfolding or becoming or happening, right? And becoming and happening, if you think about it, those words imply a future, right? That's what he means by projection. Projection to project into the future. So we're this throne projection is what he calls us. And sixth, the temporal unfolding or the time-based unfolding of a life is always embedded in a wider communal context from which it draws its possibilities of self-interpretation and self-assessment. We are participants within a shared context that provides us with our sense of meaningful options in dealing with things. Let me try to bring this down to earth for a second. So let's imagine that somebody is thrown into the world, to use Heidegger's words, or born once space travel, space exploration became possible. So their life starts to unfold. They are aware of this possibility in their particular space and time, right? Of going into outer space on a rocket or a spaceship or a shuttle. And as they grow and as their lives unfold, they begin to think, let's imagine somebody who is like, that's what I want to do. That's the possibility that this particular person wants to seize upon. I want to be an astronaut, a cosmonaut. I want to do this. And then you continue to unfold and you start to think, hey, there's something in my, it's just in my nature. I've always wanted to do this. It's in my nature. Well, part of what Heidegger's saying here is that it's impossible that this is part of your nature, because just if you were born a few decades earlier, this never would have been possible, let alone 100 years ago. It never would have come up as a possibility. We're thrown, it's an accidental quality that you have, that this is what you want to be, not an essential quality. If you were, or look at it into the future, there are things that are going to unfold in 100 years that most likely none of us are going to have access to. They are not possibilities for our existence. So what we can be and do, and I'm not talking in terms of a career necessarily, right? But what we can be, what we can become is dictated by the time in which we're born. I hope I made that as clear as possible. So Dasein, or human being as being in the world. Heidegger wants to give an account of that entity for which whom being is actually an issue, or, it's actually important to them, right? Namely, human being or Dasein. So Heidegger names human being Dasein, which translates to their being or here being, right? Um, it's to avoid the objective or scientific perspective of human being, like there is a human being, a thing in the world. He creates this new world, this Dasein, this there being and here being. It's part of his attempt to overcome the subject object distinction. He makes this like new language. And he begins with a detailed description of concrete life. As he starts being in time, he does this analysis where he's just describing everyday existence, concrete life, our everyday way of being as agents engaged in just activities and practical contexts, our everydayness. The aim of this description is to characterize the world as we encounter it, normally, if you will, prior to the kinds of reflection and theorizing common to the scientific attitude. Just how are we when we're not theorizing and being scientific? And so what comes out of this description, which I'll explain in a second, what comes out of this description is a picture of Dasein as what he calls just being in the world. He thinks it's important to not start from this theorizing and these breakdowns and this scientific attitude towards human beings. How are we otherwise in our average everydayness, he would say. And like I've mentioned before, the aim of this description is to both deflate the subjectified view of the self as a mind, where this is understood as a sort of container in which mental activities occur, and the objectified view of worldly entities as these brute static stuff and things to think about. So I'll briefly describe what he does here. He talks about being in a workshop. It's like I'm seriously paraphrasing here, but being in a workshop and how you encountered like tools in the workshop. And it's like, imagine, you have to go and hammer something to the wall, and you pick up, and that's what you're focused on. I need to get this painting up on the wall or whatever. And you pick up the hammer and you start just using it, right? What he describes is like, look, when you're in average everydayness, this hammer pretty much disappears for you, right? It's what he calls ready to hand, right? It doesn't, you are focused on using the hammer, using the tool to get the job done, right? Your focus goes beyond the thing itself as it's there, this thing, this hammer, right? You just grab it and start going, and you're not paying attention to the hammer itself. He says, now imagine if the hammer breaks, the head of the hammer falls off. That's when the hammer, you kind of freeze time, right? And you look at this hammer, you're like, what the hell went wrong with this? What's the matter? I can't believe the head of my hammer fell off the wooden handle. What am I going to do about this hammer? And you start to look at just this thing. So all of a sudden your projects go away, right? And you're looking at this thing and trying to solve a problem. He called this being present at hand. So what he's trying to break down is like, look, you got this roughly, you got the same thing, but look at the different ways we encounter it. It's invisible 1 minute, and then boom, it's visible to us in a different sort of way. He said, part of the problem is that we've taken this broken hammer sort of mode of being, and we've applied it to ourselves and to everything in the world when that's not the way that we go through life. Notice the why people characterize him as an existentialist. Yeah. So another important concept from being in time is inauthenticity and what he calls the they. So Dasein's, or human being, capital B, Dasein's primary mode of existence is one of just immersion in the they. Think hammer while it's working. We understand ourselves over and against an other, and this other isn't a definite entity. Inauthenticity, though, is a necessary mode of being. Authenticity is impossible without it, and vice versa. So here's some more. Let's break the inauthentic mode of being down. So keep it again in your mind. The modes of being, right? The way we encounter the hammer when it's working, it's kind of invisible to us. Boom, the hammer breaks. All of a sudden, it's a thing to be dealt with, right? And then once we fix it, it goes back to being invisible to us again. That's what I mean by changing modes. So in the authentic mode, we're constantly absorbed in the demands of the present. This mode is non-reflective, except in terms of strategic sort of means ends calculations, moderated by what the media tells us is good or valuable or successful. We're going along and not questioning our lives, ourselves, our motivations. We're not treating ourselves as a broken hammer. We're just going along with it. Right? What does everybody else say is good? Fine, it's good. Valuable? Okay, that's what I'll value. What does success mean? Sure, that's good for me too. And you don't even question it. You just are absorbed in this vacuous sort of what he calls the they. And the they aren't, it's not a definite entity. It's not like it's what my husband says or it's what my girlfriend says. It's just this kind of nameless, faceless theyness out there. Right? And we're just floating along in it. And this too has modes, but just, or let's just call it qualities, but modes, right? When we're in our inauthentic mode, which all of us get into, we do stuff like this. We talk idly, just blah, 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 blah. Or we're curiosity. And by curiosity, it means just kind of, that can usually seem like it's a good thing, right? I'm intellectually curious. But this means just poking your nose into everything other than yourself, being being absorbed in the business of others is what he means by curiosity, and also at the same time ambiguity. It's not taking a stand on anything. So Heidegger says this is that when we're in the they, absorbed in the they, and inauthentic, this is the kind of crap we engage in. We don't make firm decisions. We don't take stands on anything. We're poking our nose in on everybody else's business to see what they're doing, not paying attention to ourselves in any meaningful manner. And we just blah, 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 blah. That's what he means here. But now we'll talk about authenticity on the other hand. For Heidegger, the concept of authenticity does not mean like something like getting in touch with your feelings or keeping it real. It means becoming more intensely engaged in the world of one's historical culture, because your particular historical culture is what you are, it constitutes you. You constitute it. It is the backdrop from which you can determine any and all of your possibilities of being. But also, it's not a state that you attain once and for all. It's not like you work real hard. It's like, all right, killer, I'm authentic now forever. It doesn't mean that you abandon inauthenticity, that you're never again going to do idle blah, 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 or be curious and nosy, or be indecisive, right? You're always going to be that. It's part of everyday, it's part of life, right? But you change your relationship to it, right? To be authentic means you still are going to be inauthentic, but you're not absolutely taken over by it. You understand it differently. You understand all that stuff differently. Right? So instead, authentic Dasein will have moments of vision, he says, in which you see yourself for what you are. And these moments in an authentic life will involve Dasein resolving to have further moments of vision in the future, despite your inherent propensity to fall into inauthenticity. You get these moments of vision where you see your, it's kind of like a boundary situation for Jaspers, right? Like this, where you grab yourself and see yourself clearly as a historical being, and particularly a finite being. We'll talk about that in a second. And you take this seriously. Like, I just got a glimpse into my true nature that isn't being washed over by Vevey and inauthenticity. You experience it, anxiety and all, and you say, I gotta have more of these. It's keying me into my true self, for lack of a better word. The authentic life, then, involves a pattern in which one consistently recognizes falling into your they self. Yeah, you see when it happens, you're like, here I go into the they self, and you respond to it through resolving to have future moments of authenticity. But again, you never just dwell here. It's impossible, he says. Now, disclosing death, and that's the master key to authenticity. So disclosing means to uncover or revealing your own eventual death to yourself, is what he's talking about. So disclosing one's inevitable death regularly and consistently, and allowing yourself to experience the anxiety that comes along with that, is the key to experiencing authentic moments of vision, authentic self understanding. Put into just normal everyday language, it's almost like beckoning near death experiences. Have you ever, but not out in the world, mind you? He says you can do this with careful focus. Right? If you've ever read about or even known somebody who's had a near death experience, it's almost always the case that their lives are changed dramatically after that. Dramatically. What they find important, how they use their time, what they value, how they live. Um, Heidegger is essentially saying there's a way to come into contact with your inevitable death that will give you this experience that is similar to a near death experience without actually having to do something dangerous, right? And if you do this enough, you kind of train yourself to understand your your nature as a finite being in the world, and you can kind of cultivate these moments of vision. I know again that this may sound bizarre to some of you, and it certainly a lot of Heidegger strikes people as bizarre, but let's just go with it. Um, so anxiety reveals to us what Heidegger calls our thrownness unto death. And it makes us realize that our normal tendency to throw ourselves into like publicly approved roles or ways of being or norms is actually a form of like fleeing or evasion of what we know to be true, that we're finite, that we're going to die, right? A day will come when our lives are completed and our life story is over. And what he's saying is that when we busy ourselves with a bunch of crap and idle, meaningless talk and nosiness and not taking a stand on stuff, it's it's a flight from our true reality, that we're fleeing our the knowledge that we're eventually not going to be here. We're running from it and hiding in all that kind of stuff. And just as a fictional story gains its meaning from where it's headed as a whole, so our lives gain their meaning from where they're headed as a totality. And just as each of the events in a story contributes to the overall meaning of that story or how things are going to finally turn out, so for our lives, each of our actions is contributing to the final configuration of meaning our lives will have in the end. So to be authentic then is to seize on some set of roles you've drawn from the public world meaning your historical culture, your here, the world into which you were thrown, seize on some set of possibilities and make them your own through a resolute and clear-sighted stand on them. And we'll start to close here with a quote, one from Heidegger. Once one has grasped the finitude of one's existence, one is snatched back from the endless multiplicity of possibilities which offer themselves as closest to one, those of comfortableness, shirking, and taking things lightly. Right? Once you are able to repeatedly, and really remind yourself, not just in some intellectual way, like, yeah, I know I'm going to die one day, but really experience the idea and cope with the anxiety that comes with an honest disclosure of your own mortality. Once you've fully grasped it and felt that through, what it does is it enables you to kind of grab your peace and focus on it with clarity. And you stop being comfortable and saying, I'll do it tomorrow. Who cares? Blah, 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 blah. Things change and are brought into focus if you exercise your understanding of your own mortality, he says. And in other words, once anxiety makes us realize that we're delivered over to ourselves and that it's up to us alone to make something of our lives, then we're going to simplify our lives, shaping the roles we have adopted into a form that gives them direction and focus. So, uniting, in a sense, past, present, and future. You're going to see where you've been, take stock of where you've been, what you've developed in your past, understand it, disclose it to yourself, and disclose your own mortality to yourself in the present, and then project a project of your life, a story of your life with clarity into the future. Okay. I hope that some of this made some sense, everybody. And that is some Heidegger.